Why are Eritreans in exile being silenced? Activists and critics who escaped repression at home find they're not safe abroad either. Who is threatening them for speaking out? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Divya Gopalan. Now, Eritrea is often described as one of the most repressive countries in Africa. People's rights are severely restricted and opponents of the President Isaias Afwerki are locked up in jail. Even Eritreans in exile are apparently not safe. Amnesty International is accusing the government of harassing and threatening activists living in Europe and elsewhere in Africa. Eritrea is a member of the UN's Human Rights Council, which is meeting in Geneva this week. One Eritrean in exile in Kenya described her experience to Al Jazeera's Malcolm Webb.
We used to work together.
Abiba Walder-Hymanot says she's never enjoyed the freedom she fought for. She was 17 when she joined Eritrea's rebellion and fought for independence from Ethiopia. She's seen here in one of the rebels' mountain hideouts in the 1980s. Independence came in 1991, but she says freedom did not.
If they want to kill you, they can kill you automatically.
She owned a factory, but she didn't join the governing party or contribute to its funding. She says she's been harassed ever since, including here in Kenya's capital Nairobi, where she lives in exile. She says Eritrea's ambassador to Kenya accused her of terrorism and had her arrested by local police.
He's involving in your life, in your business. He tried. He saw us like 5-6 times in the CID headquarters, saying nonsense things. He tried to deport us.
Rights activists say that the kind of harassment that Abiba says she's experienced here in Nairobi is just the tip of the iceberg, and that Eritrean critics of Eritrea's government who are living in exile all around the world are routinely harassed, intimidated and even beaten by government supporters.
So the report has to...
Rights group Amnesty International says it's documented cases of harassment and intimidation of Eritrean human rights activists over the last 8 years. It's published a report, and its researchers say those in Kenya, the UK, Sweden and some other European countries are most at risk.
The Eritrean government is kind of exporting the repression from its territory to another country, and it doesn't look good to Eritrean human rights record, and it doesn't look good to the record of the countries where this repression is happening.
The report documents seemingly coordinated, threatening tweets from staff at Eritrea's embassies. Its ambassador in Kenya didn't agree to give us an interview. Abiba says the harassment has made her more critical. Most of her activist colleagues here in Nairobi were too scared to speak to us.
They are in prison.
She's campaigned for 4 of her friends from her days as a rebel who were since arrested in Eritrea. She doesn't know if they're still imprisoned or dead. The same fate, she says, awaits her if she ever goes home. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, the situation in Eritrea is also bleak. Rights groups say the one-party state doesn't tolerate dissent. Researchers believe there are more than 360 prisons in the country. Compulsory national service in the military is indefinite, and activists say conscripts are being used as forced labor. There's no private media, and only 2% of the 5 million population can access the internet. Reporters Without Borders says press freedom in Eritrea is only slightly better than North Korea. And with an estimated 4,000 people leaving the country every month, Eritrea is one of the largest sources of African refugees in Europe. We can now bring in our guests. In London, we have Selam Kidane. She's the director of Release Eritrea. That's a human rights organization. In Addis Ababa on Skype, Awol Allo, Africa analyst and senior lecturer at Keele University. And also in London, Martin PLAUT, a senior research fellow at University of London. And he's also the author of Understanding Eritrea Inside Africa's Most Repressive State. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being here on the program. The one thing that many people know about Eritrea is that very little is known about that country and what goes on inside that country. So that's something I do want to explore as this program unfolds. But before that, I'd like to talk about this whole idea of dissenters, not only in Eritrea, but also those outside the country coming under the reach of the regime, which is very alarming. And Selam Kidane, I want to start with you. And you've worked closely with refugees, many of them who've left the country and have been able to tell you about what's happening in there. But I'd also like to know what you're hearing about their experiences when they speak out against the government and how they're affected by it.
Oh, yeah. Actually, it's only people that have left the country that are actually able to speak about what's been happening to them. So it's not surprising that the regime is actually trying to clamp down on people who have already left and are trying to speak about the realities of what they have left and what the kinds of things that people tell are really extreme religious persecution, where people are actually banned from praying together if they're not members of government sanctioned churches, people who are incarcerated for not returning to their national service posts even for a couple of days, people who are accused of thinking about leaving the country, people who are accused of sympathizing with the opposition forces outside the country. So people are being attacked for all sorts of things whilst they're in the country. Outside the country, when they come out, people are threatened by actions being, don't you fear for your family back home is a common threat. Another one is that, the hand of the revolution, which is hand of the government, is long and it will catch up with you anywhere you are. So the entire Eritrean diaspora can at times be gripped by fear of what the government might be able to do.
Martin Plaut, it's not just Eritreans abroad who are facing harassment from the hand of the government, as Selam had put it. You too have come under attack for speaking out. Can you tell us about your experience?
Well, it's happened a couple of times. I mean, when we've had arranged talks in London, there have been attempts to break up the talks at universities, some of the times physical, mostly just yelling and shouting and trying to make it impossible to talk. But a more serious one happened late last year, where somebody tried to suggest to me that they would like to meet me, and I'm a journalist and author, so I'm always keen to meet people, and they asked me, can we meet somewhere? And so I said, yes, we'll meet in a public space at the British Library, in fact. And when I got there, they then said, well, look, would you mind coming outside because I'm with somebody, he's frightened of being on camera and this kind of thing, which there might be cameras in the British Library. So I said, sure, and I met him in a little open space, a cafe just outside. He went and got me a coffee, I sat down, and then he went behind a low bush, picks up a box full of liquid, I didn't know what it was, throws it over me, while he's filming me at the same time on his camera, and there are two other Eritreans doing exactly the same, and yells at me that I'm a traitor to the government, that I'm a functionary of the CIA, that I'm abusing his country, and that I'm all the rest, that I deserve to be dispatched in an appropriate manner, all this kind of thing. Anyway, I just backed away and left it, and the man was arrested and finally prosecuted, and we went to court, and he was found guilty and fined for what he had done. Now, of course, I was really worried about what had been thrown at me because, of course, it came a few months after the attack in Salisbury in Britain, where liquid was put on people and they died as a result. That was a Russian operation, but this one was done by Eritreans sympathetic to the regime. And so it was a worrying event, but I mean, of course, it's nothing compared to the repression that is faced by people inside Eritrea, which is much, much, much more severe.
Mm-hmm. Awol Allo, Martin Plaut is continuing to speak out about what's happening in Eritrea. But what has this kind of intimidation done, or what kind of an impact has it had on others, activists, Eritrean activists, or just general people who managed to leave Eritrea from speaking out to the government? Has it had an impact on them?
I think it is important to kind of put this into context because Eritrea is an authoritarian state. The government there clearly rejects the idea of democracy as a defining form of governing population. And most authoritarian governments thrive on silencing voices that are opposed to them. And indeed, one of the most defining features of an authoritarian system is basically harassing, intimidating, and bullying all opposition forms, particularly human rights defenders. So several countries in Africa, Eritrea, Libya, Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, in the past used these systems. And in fact, some of them went as far as using highly sophisticated state-of-the-art technologies produced by European companies, by Israeli companies, to conduct sophisticated surveillance against frontline human rights defenders. So this is a general pattern across Africa. I'm sure several other authoritarian governments use it, but Eritrea has a very particular kind of problem in terms of cyberbullying and people who express their views being attacked by activists.
So that's something I want to talk about is the international community. The UN's Human Rights Council has enlisted Eritrea as a member of its council. What is the justification for this, and how does that make you feel, Selam Kidane, once you hear the stories from the refugees you've been dealing with?
It's actually quite disparaging. It shouldn't be surprising, but it is. It shouldn't be surprising given the other countries on that list of members as well. But as an Eritrean and knowing intimately what goes on in Eritrea, it is indeed, it's very shocking. It's saddening. It also is, it makes a mockery of the system that is meant to monitor human rights, respect for human rights at the highest level globally, to be, for one of the member states overlooking this work to be one of the most abject violators. So yeah, it's surprising, it's shocking, and it's sad.
Awol Allo, I want to bring it down to the basics here. Very few people know exactly what is going on inside Eritrea, and if you could sum up for us, what is happening in Eritrea? What is happening to the average person there?
I think, as you said in the introduction, it is really very difficult to know what is actually going on in Eritrea. It is a pretty closed system. There is very little access to the media. Media is controlled by the government. There is no independent media. But we know that people leave Eritrea in huge numbers. National service is a huge problem. Government does not tolerate opposing voices. Those who oppose do so at a significant risk to their safety. So the massive, I think, widespread human rights violations are very well known. They are very well documented. But it is very difficult actually to get a sense of what is actually happening in Eritrea. We see the reports from time to time documenting various violations of human rights. But beyond that, we haven't really seen very clear evidence of the nature of abuses, violations that happens there. I just wanted to say make one very quick point on the Human Rights Council and Eritrea's membership of Human Rights Council. I think it's important to realize that the United Nations generally and its various human rights systems are not really there primarily to protect individuals, and particularly individuals in these authoritarian nations. They are part of a broader set of compromise among various states, various nations. So if you look at, for example, the countries that have been on the membership of the Council, they are some of the worst abusers of human rights. So it is a give and take between the various states that takes place in terms of the process of electing countries. I don't think we should put too much emphasis on who is on the Human Rights Council and who is not.
Mm-hmm. Martin Plaut, on that note, firstly, can you shed any more light on what is happening in Eritrea, particularly to the common person, and to the whole idea of this UN Human Rights Council not necessarily protecting the wider population, instead is more about the governments?
Well, I mean, that's absolutely right. And I mean, the only thing I would say about it is that the UN has appointed a special rapporteur on human rights in Eritrea. And She and her predecessor have repeatedly attempted to negotiate, to talk to the Eritrean government and to visit the country, and she's been consistently blocked from doing so. So there's absolutely no interest from the government in participating in that dialogue. The other thing one mustn't forget is that the Eritreans are now in charge of what's known as the Khartoum process. That is the relationship between the European Union and Africa. All the major African nations, particularly bordering on the Mediterranean, are part of that system, and they're supposed to control the flow of refugees and migrants from Africa. And Eritrea is in control of that. Now, that is something sanctioned by the European Union, which is really disgusting. When you ask about the impact on ordinary people, one of the most shocking things about the Eritrean government is their lack of concern about the hardship that people undergo. There has been very little development in Eritrea since independence, which is tragic because Eritreans are some of the most hardworking and ingenious people I've ever come across, and they would certainly like to develop. But the government basically says, we don't need aid, we don't need any assistance, we can stand on our own 2 feet, which in itself is quite laudable. But the fact is, at the end of the day, they don't even encourage investment from other Eritreans in the diaspora who would love to invest if there was a secure climate to do it in. So the result is that people are very poor. There are shortages of things like electricity, of water, all these kind of things. There's poor services that people have to rely on. And that is the cost that ordinary people are having as a result of this regime.
Awol, one of the few facts that have come out, and I don't know how accurate it is that less than 2% of the population pay tax. So how is the government surviving? Who is propping them up? I mean, Martin just told us about the fact that they're rejecting not only European aid, but they're also rejecting money from Eritreans abroad. So how is that country functioning?
I think Eritreans abroad still pay a 2% tax on their income. This is compulsory for Eritreans who live abroad if they want to go back to their country, if they want to secure, for example, a passport for their children, they have to evidence that they have been paying that tax. I do not know how many Eritreans live abroad and how much remittance Eritrea earns from those taxes. But the fact that Eritrea has not made significant progress in terms of economic development means that there's not really much happening in terms of the government providing the basic infrastructures, the basic necessities for the population. But I also want to note that I think Eritreans are very hardworking people, I think very intelligent people. They have managed to find a way of providing for some basic necessities. Actually, if you compare some of the kind of essentials in Eritrea with some other countries, Eritrea is doing well. Where do they get the money to do that? I don't know. There are certain countries in the Middle East, for example, that have relationship with Eritrea, but I don't know if those countries are supporting the Eritreans in terms of financial and other budgetary support.
Selam Kidane, one of the things that I think many would find baffling is this whole idea of military conscription and the fact that it is indefinite. Many people, I understand, or many of the refugees who've left Eritrea have used that as a reason or are saying, it's bonded labor. Basically, what are you hearing about it, and what do you face when you are in the military?
I mean, in fact, it's enslavement of an entire generation, because if you think about it, the last year of high school education is actually only given at the military training center, the Sawa Military Training Center, which is at the age of 16 or 17. All young people have to go there from the entire country. And from that point onwards, at the age of 16 or 17, they're all conscripts, basically. They're told it's an educational facility, but they're regimented. They have got their battalions, and they have got, they're given military training alongside their studies. And more importantly, they cannot do that year at home. And from that point onwards, they are basically soldiers. So after that, it's endless. If they're told they've passed exams, then they would go for education, and then be given civilian jobs. Otherwise, most will become soldiers, going to the army, and there's no end to that. There's no official end to that. People leave the country, or people just abscond and stay at home. So it becomes effectively indefinite. There are people who have been serving since 1994, and there are people who have left after serving 20 years, 10 years. And now increasingly what we see is young people, children, leaving before they hit that age. And because the regime has made it impossible for people to live with their children, because anybody who's got a child over, basically, if you're a toddler and above, then you cannot leave the country without special permission. So people are living with their children as soon as they're born, or they're waiting for their children to be old enough to cross the borders illegally. So the National Service has got a hold on the entire citizenry, the entire generation. And yes, it is an indefinite bondage of slavery.
Martin, it's really hard to fathom what kind of a society is being created, and it's very easy to understand why people want to leave that country, sadly. You've met President Isaias. Do you have a clear understanding of what he is trying to build, if anything at all?
That's a very good question, and I'm afraid it's hard to answer. You know, he is somebody who basically believes that he is Eritrea, that there is nothing that is not him, that he personifies the entire country, and that anybody who steps out of line at all or questions anything that he does is basically incorrect and against the whole nation, because he is the nation. And he's always taken an utterly inflexible view of his role and that of the struggle. I mean, in the 30 years that they fought against the Ethiopians for their independence, and it was one of the most heroic struggles that Africa has ever seen. I mean, he didn't tolerate any kind of opposition of any kind. People were killed as a result. And when I met him, you know, there is something about him. He's an intelligent man, but he's somebody who, you know, literally looks at you as if he has an utter contempt for you and for anything that you might think about or want to say. And although he used a lot of people from abroad at various times to help the struggle for independence, and, you know, I certainly supported the independence of Eritrea and, you know, their continued existence. But, you know, he doesn't rate anybody who isn't an absolute supporter of him personally and the few people who are around him.
Given that, Selam, do the people you speak to, and many of them who freshly left the country, have any hope that there will be some kind of regime change, or that Eritrea will eventually have a democracy?
Absolutely. Every Eritrean lives for that day. Even those that say they support the regime live for the day that change will come. Eritrea is such a small country, and everybody is kind of has got this strong sense of identity as an Eritrean, and that it's the strength of that identity that keeps everybody going. The situation is totally unsustainable. There isn't, you would be, if people were talking honestly, it would be very difficult to find people who support what's going on beyond the fear factor, beyond the sheer cheerleading type support for the government. If you come to the nitty-gritty of the continuation of the nation, everybody agrees that there needs to be change, and that's what keeps people like me hopeful that we will be able to salvage some kind of democracy, some kind of justice for our nation, and I'm not unique in thinking that.
So much more discussion needed, and so much more to talk about. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our show. I'd like to thank our guests, Selam Kidane, Awol Allo, and Martin PLAUT, of course. All of you, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for speaking to us on this very important and interesting country. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. You'll find that at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, why don't you go to our Facebook page? You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And remember, you can always join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Well, from me and the team here, this is Inside Story. Thank you for watching.